Singapore started off getting independence in 1965, and it was in a very weak position. It was a small country. It had no natural resources. It was dependent on basic things such as water to be imported from its bigger neighbor in Malaysia, and it didn't have much of an army to defend itself. 50 years later, Singapore had become one of the richest countries in the world. It has one of the highest GDPs. It is a country where people have some of the highest living expectations, and it managed to increase its territory by 22% by reclaiming it from the sea. It also managed to have more exports than the whole of Australia at about $515 billion. And it has a very sizable military, which has been ranked 29th largest in the world. So how did Singapore go from this small, weak country into what it is today? I ended up reading Lee Kuan Yew's book From Third World to First World, which is really like an instruction manual explaining how Singapore went from being a third world country to a first world country. And I like to give you a few of these examples. For example, government expenditures. In most countries, um, government agency ends up having automatic increases in budget. And often these increases are being wasted because the agency will just spend it on anything because they're afraid that they won't be getting a bigger increase next time. In Singapore, on the other hand, the government agencies actually have a smaller budget every year, and the additional money goes into a common tub where these agencies have to try and recover it by providing some sort of improvement of what they can do. So this system ensures that if one government agency wants to restructure the IT system, it maybe provides a way for clients, for citizens to automatically do something through their phone instead of having to go into the office. And maybe that requires a large budget. Well, that ministry might be selected to get the bulk of the extra funding. And the simple expedient essentially creates a kind of competition between the ministries, which creates for a lot more efficient government. It doesn't cost any additional money. It actually saves money. Another example, taxation at source. In places like Germany, the income tax is going up and up. The sales tax keeps on going higher. We're paying over 20% now. We're paying taxes on capital gains, on interest. At some point, you wonder why you're working at all. In Singapore, once I moved here, my taxation rate personally has dropped to maybe around 4%. I don't have to pay taxes on interest. I don't pay tax on capital gains. I have a very simple tax return. Usually it's automated. I have to literally not do anything. And I pay my taxes due in 9 rates the next year. So how does Singapore keep these rates so low, beside being a very efficient government? Well, say have a taxation at source concept. So saying if I can tax on some luxury or some other way, then I don't need to get the tax from everybody's income. And so one good example is cars in Singapore. Singapore has an excellent public transportation system. Taxis are not very expensive. And so it's a city. You don't really need to have a car. But of course, people do want to have a car, and there are reasons for people to have certain cars. But if everybody can have a car, we end up with one big parking lot. It will be like Bangkok, where you can sit in traffic for 20 minutes without moving a single meter. So Singapore limits the number of cars. And for somebody to be able to drive, you have to get what's called a certificate of entitlement. It's a driving permit attached to your car, which allows you to drive for 10 years. Now, for you to be able to buy the certificate of entitlement, it's a simple bidding process whereby the government every quarter or so releases a certain number of COE certificates which will be made available. On average, let's say it's going to be around 45,000 new cars, COEs, and the market will then determine how much of these COEs cost. Right now, it's more than 100,000 US dollars just to get the permit. If you take $100,000, you multiply times 45,000, you end up with 4.5 billion US dollars collected just for driving permits. You have 100% taxation on cars, which combined makes Singapore a very bad place to own a car in terms of the costs. It's one of the most expensive places in the world when it comes to owning a car. But at the same time, you can go to the local hawker center, which is sort of like a food court, get really pretty good food and just pay $3 or $4 for it. But given that, there's so much wealth here, this has become a big income source for the government. And it means that roads, public transportation, and a lot of these expenditures can be funded from people driving the cars. So that's the kind of taxation at source which is happening and which is keeping taxes lower for the rest of us. Another concept which Singapore does, which I believe should be copied more and more in Western countries, is to pay our politicians more. It might seem counterintuitive, and people often complain about the politicians. But the idea is that if we want to have better people, and not everybody is rich enough to do this thing for a low salary, then we ought to be paying more. And in Singapore, for example, prime ministers earning around 1.6 million US dollars, which might sound a lot, but if you think about the kind of decision a prime minister makes or a president, that is money very, very well spent if you're able to get somebody who is more competent in making these decisions. At the same time, Singapore gives you a carrot, but it also has a big stick in the form of the Corrupt Practices Bureau, which essentially monitors politicians very closely to make sure that you don't have favoritism or some other sort of behavior which isn't really acceptable. At the same time, a corollary to that is that it's usually a problem, and I think in the US in particular, this has become an object of quite a lot of debate, is lobbying. If you are a senator or you're some other high-level politician, you have a career in politics, and then you leave and you become a private consultant at very high salaries for some industry. The question is always, why did you get that job? Did you do some favors to that industry? Or did you get that job because you use your political connections you have now in order to lobby for certain industries? And with this problem of corporate welfare that we're having more and more, this is becoming a sensitive issue. In Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew recognized this problem about 40 years ago, and there were strict limits towards the ability of people to switch from industry into politics and back and forth. So these are the kind of policies, long-term policies, which made the government more independent, looking at what's best for the country as a whole, as opposed to being guided by the interest of a certain industry. Something else which has worked out really well in Singapore is the way pension systems are handled. It has always been a system where you pay in the money, and the money that's being poured in is in your account, it's yours. The government will never take it. If you die, that money goes to your next of kin. If you leave Singapore for good, the government pays it out for you. I have a friend who's now working for Google, Silicon Valley. He moved from Singapore back to the United States, and the CPF authorities are kind of writing him saying, hey, take the money out. You're not here anymore. We don't want to pay you the interest on it. Take the money out. So it's the only system I know of where it's actually chasing you to take money instead of paying it in. So the other thing you can do with CPF money is you can pay your mortgage. So Singapore is saying, you need to put money as savings in CPF, but your home is an investment for you. And so why not use that money to pay your mortgage? That's one of the ways Singapore encourages home ownership. And the money that goes in CPF, therefore, really is something usable in your name. You can also use this money to pay for medical expenses. You can pay it for education. You can pay it for education for your children. But if your children use it, they have to pay it back. The government will garnish their wages if need be to make sure that money comes back, because ultimately that money is meant for your retirement. And the government doesn't want you to end up being penniless, because then you might become a governmental problem. They want to prevent the problem from happening in the first place. Another concept Singapore has is that you should never make something free. If you make something free, then people don't really value it. If you look at free healthcare, for example, people think it's a matter of course, and abuse tends to go up. So in Singapore, the idea is, let's subsidize healthcare and find a way to subsidize the people who need it, but without us deciding who needs it. And the way it's being done in Singapore, which is quite ingenious, is that if you go to a public hospital, which have very high quality, by the way, you can choose 3 levels of comfort. You can choose grade A, where you have your own room, air conditioned with TV and all bells and whistles, high-end food and so on. And you will have no subsidy by the government if you choose that comfort level. You have a 2-person room where you're in the room with somebody else, and you get a 40% subsidy. Or you go into an 8-person room, in which case the government will subsidize up to 90%, with the remaining 10% coming from your CPF. So if you're very wealthy, you will probably choose to go with option A and get no subsidy from the government. If you're short on money, of course, you will go to section C. And this is a self-adjusting system where fraud and abuse sort of is minimized. Is up to the person to decide. And again, that's an example of how there's a different view on how things can be done. And if you take these sort of policies, and in the book from Lee Kuan Yew, you will find 10, 15, 20 of these policies, and you put them together, then you come up with a way of governing which tends to be a lot more efficient, and which in the case of Singapore has produced these amazing results.